The Supreme Court is set to decide whether the Trump administration's tariffs overstepped presidential authority, a case that could redefine the balance of power between the president and Congress. At stake is not just the legality of these tariffs, but the future scope of executive power in shaping U.S. economic policy. Businesses, consumers, and international partners have faced years of uncertainty as the legal battle has unfolded. The court's ruling will set a precedent for how much unilateral authority presidents have over trade, with consequences for generations. A decision upholding the tariffs could embolden future presidents to bypass Congress on major economic issues. Conversely, striking them down would reaffirm Congress's constitutional role in trade, setting new limits on executive action. In 2018, the Trump administration unveiled a bold and highly controversial trade strategy that would soon dominate headlines and spark heated debates across the nation. Central to this approach were sweeping tariffs, which specifically targeted steel, aluminum, and a vast array of goods imported from China. These measures were introduced as a cornerstone of the administration's America First agenda, aiming to reshape the global trade landscape and reassert American economic power. The tariffs were designed not only to protect American industries from what the administration described as unfair foreign competition, but also to pressure China into negotiating more favorable trade terms for the United States. By imposing these duties, the administration hoped to revive domestic manufacturing, create jobs, and reduce the nation's trade deficit. Supporters of the tariffs, including many workers and business owners in the manufacturing sector, saw them as a necessary shield against the flood of cheaper imports. They believed these measures would level the playing field, strengthen American industry, and restore lost jobs in communities hit hard by globalization. However, critics from both political parties and the business community warned of serious consequences. They argued that tariffs would inevitably raise costs for American consumers and companies, disrupt complex global supply chains, and provoke retaliatory measures from trading partners, potentially escalating into damaging trade wars that could hurt the broader economy. Legally, the administration justified these tariffs using statutes such as Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allows for trade restrictions on national security grounds, and Section 301 of the Trade Act, which addresses unfair foreign trade practices. But perhaps most controversially, the White House invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law originally intended to address extraordinary threats to national security, not routine trade disputes. The use of IEEPA to justify broad tariffs ignited a fierce debate about the limits of presidential power. Some argued that the law's broad language gave the president wide latitude to act in the nation's interest, especially in times of perceived economic emergency. Proponents insisted that decisive executive action was necessary to protect American interests and that the president was well within his rights to use every available tool to confront economic threats from abroad. Opponents, however, contended that this was a dangerous overreach, an abuse of emergency powers that set a troubling precedent. They warned that allowing such broad authority could undermine the constitutional balance between Congress and the president. The controversy quickly escalated, setting the stage for a major constitutional showdown that would test the boundaries of executive authority and the role of Congress in trade policy. Now, with the nation watching closely, the Supreme Court faces a pivotal decision. Was the president's use of emergency authority to impose sweeping tariffs lawful, or did it cross a constitutional line? The outcome could reshape the future of American trade policy and executive power for years to come. IEEPA, passed in 1977, was designed to let presidents respond to foreign threats by regulating international commerce during emergencies. Traditionally, it's been used for targeted sanctions, not sweeping tariffs. The Trump administration's use of IEEPA to address trade deficits marked a dramatic expansion of its purpose. Critics argue this move sidesteps Congress's constitutional power over tariffs and taxes. Supporters counter that IEEPA's broad language gives the president flexibility to act in economic crises. The Supreme Court must now decide whether this interpretation fits the law's intent and the Constitution. The outcome will define the limits of emergency economic powers. The United States Constitution carefully divides power between the branches of government, and when it comes to trade, it specifically gives Congress the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations and to set tariffs. This foundational principle was designed to ensure that no single branch could dominate the nation's economic policy, keeping a balance of power at the heart of American democracy. However, as the world and the economy have grown more complex, Congress has, over the decades, chosen to delegate some of its trade authority to the president. This shift was not accidental. It was a practical response to the need for swift action in a rapidly changing global marketplace, where waiting for lengthy legislative debates could put the U.S. at a disadvantage. Laws such as the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 were landmark moments, giving the president new tools to negotiate trade agreements and respond to international economic challenges. The Trade Act of 1974 further expanded executive powers, allowing the president to impose tariffs or quotas in certain situations, but always with the expectation that Congress would maintain oversight and set clear boundaries. These laws were crafted to allow the executive branch to act quickly in times of crisis or when urgent economic decisions were needed, but they were never meant to give the president unlimited authority. Congress built in checks and balances requiring regular reports, hearings, and the ability to revoke or amend the president's powers if necessary. Today, a major legal battle is unfolding over whether recent presidents have stretched these delegated powers beyond their intended limits, especially by invoking emergency statutes to justify sweeping economic actions. Critics argue that using emergency powers for broad economic measures goes far beyond what Congress originally intended, raising concerns about executive overreach. Plaintiffs in the case claim that this undermines Congress's constitutional role as the primary architect of trade policy and threatens the delicate balance of power that has defined the U.S. government for centuries. They warn that if unchecked, this trend could upset the constitutional balance, giving the president too much control over the nation's economic future. On the other side, the administration argues that Congress knowingly granted these authorities, understanding the need for flexibility and decisive action in a complex world. Now, the Supreme Court faces a pivotal decision. Was the president acting within the scope of power that Congress delegated, or did these actions cross the line into unconstitutional territory? The outcome of this case will not only determine the future of trade policy, but could also reshape the fundamental separation of powers between Congress and the presidency for generations to come. At the heart of this pivotal case lies the major questions doctrine, a legal principle that has become increasingly significant in recent years as the boundaries of executive power are tested in the highest courts. This doctrine holds that when it comes to decisions of vast economic and political consequence, Congress must speak clearly and directly if it intends to grant such sweeping authority to the executive branch. It's not enough for the law to be vague or open-ended. The intent must be unmistakable. In this case, challengers argue that the administration's decision to impose broad tariffs is precisely the kind of major question that demands explicit congressional approval. They contend that such significant actions cannot rest solely on a general or ambiguous emergency statute. Instead, they insist, only a clear and specific mandate from Congress can justify such far-reaching executive measures. If the Supreme Court agrees with this argument, the justices will closely examine the text of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, searching for unmistakable language that authorizes the president's actions. Without that clear authorization, the court could rule that the tariffs represent an overreach of executive authority, potentially striking them down and sending a strong message about the limits of presidential power. This case therefore stands as a crucial test for the major questions doctrine itself, and for the broader principle of checks and balances that underpins the American system of government. A ruling against the administration would reinforce the idea that Congress must provide clear, detailed guidance when authorizing major policy shifts, ensuring that no single branch can act unilaterally on issues of national importance. The outcome of this case will set a powerful precedent, shaping how far future presidents can go in interpreting and using emergency powers and influencing the balance of power between the legislative and executive branches for years to come. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's decision will echo across future executive actions, defining the boundaries of presidential authority and the role of Congress in safeguarding democratic governance. The legal fight over the tariffs began with lawsuits from businesses and trade groups who claimed economic harm. The U.S. Court of International Trade initially ruled against the administration, finding the president exceeded IEEPA authority. The government appealed, and the case was heard by an expanded panel at the Federal Circuit, highlighting its national importance. Both sides were determined to take the issue to the Supreme Court, given the profound constitutional questions involved. The justices are now tasked with interpreting IEEPA, statutory intent, and the separation of powers. Their ruling will determine the fate of billions in tariffs and set a lasting precedent for executive power in trade. The stakes for the U.S. economy and government structure could not be higher. Years of tariff battles have created deep uncertainty for the U.S. economy. Businesses, from manufacturers to farmers, have struggled to plan amid shifting policies and the threat of new tariffs or retaliation. Studies show that tariffs raised costs for American importers and consumers, while retaliatory measures hurt U.S. exports, especially in agriculture. Financial markets have been volatile, reacting sharply to trade news and legal developments. The ongoing legal fight perpetuates instability, making it hard for companies to invest or expand. Even if the Supreme Court strikes down the tariffs, economic disruption won't vanish overnight. Supply chains have shifted, and business relationships have been altered, leaving lasting effects. The case highlights how legal uncertainty can ripple through the global economy. The administration's main defense is national security, arguing that economic threats like trade deficits and reliance on foreign goods justify emergency action. By framing tariffs as a response to economic vulnerabilities, the administration claims IEEPA grants the president broad authority. Supporters say protecting key industries is essential for national security. Critics argue this rationale is a pretext for protectionism and that general trade imbalances don't qualify as emergencies. The Supreme Court must decide how much deference to give the president's definition of a national security threat. The answer will shape the boundaries of executive power in economic policy. The ruling will set a standard for future uses of emergency authority. The Supreme Court's decision will reshape U.S. trade policy and the balance of power in government. If the court sides with the administration, presidents could wield broad emergency powers to set trade policy, sidelining Congress. This would make trade policy more volatile and president-driven, weakening legislative oversight. If the court rules against the administration, it will reaffirm Congress's authority and limit executive overreach. Emergency powers would no longer be a shortcut for major economic changes. The ruling will force future presidents to work with Congress on significant trade decisions. Ultimately, the case asks, who should control America's trade policy in a complex global economy, the president or Congress? The answer will define the nation's approach to economic statecraft for years to come.